Vis medicatrix naturae. Coming up on Inner Athlete Training. Welcome back to Inner Athlete Training Podcast. I'm your host, James Jankiewicz, and we are up around 5-ish, I think, episode number 5. And we are still going on with our history of physical culture. We're back into history and philosophy this time. But this time we're making a slight little deviation where we're going to leave the physical culture behind in terms of exercise and training. We'll get back to that with Rome on the next podcast. But right now what we want to do is while we're right at the beginning, let's start picking up the ideas of medicine too. Where did the early ideas of medicine come from? Where did they start from? Why are they important? Which ones do we still hold near and dear today? Which ones have we abandoned and said bye-bye? And so let's start with that. So we're going to start right at the beginning with the Greek civilization with the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates. Now, even in Hippocrates' writings, he does give a nod to some of the early Egyptian physicians. There were people who came before him, absolutely. But to keep it simple, we're starting from Greek civilization. Now, we will go back to some of the earlier people as we need to, as we stumble upon their work, as we see down the road as their work has influenced other things, we'll trickle back. But it would be way too much to get into right now to start with every single person. So we're just going to look at a lot of the ideas that collectively were floating around and then use Greece as the conduit by which they all kind of funnel through. So in this case, Hippocrates is no different. He is considered the father of modern medicine. Why? Why such an honor? Like why does he deserve that particular accolade? Well, basically in the ancient world, they were trying to figure out, amongst everything else, what this idea of sickness was and disease. They would watch people get sick, they'd watch people succumb to diseases, and they didn't really know what they were, so they were trying to form a model of why this happens, and is there anything we can even do about it? Right? In trying to explain this in the ancient world, a lot was always pawned off on gods. All right, God's always got the brunt of it. So even if you were, let's say, fiddling around on the coral reef, off the coast of Greece and having a nice time, and maybe you stubbed your toe and you bled or whatever the case may be, you may have pissed off Poseidon. You may have pissed off the god Poseidon. You may have done something to aggravate Zeus at some point, and then Zeus comes down and rains all sorts of bad karma upon you, right? So the metaphysical understanding of gods, was pretty much the scapegoat for just about everything, including sickness. So if you did something bad, it was because you pissed off one of the gods. So what did this all mean, and why did Hippocrates change it? Well, before we take a deeper dive, who was Hippocrates? Let's start with that. We know Hippocrates was born in Greece. We know Hippocrates lived during the age of Pericles, when Pericles was the ruler of Athens. We know Hippocrates is considered the paragon of modern medicine, but like with so many of our ancient historic figures, it's difficult sometimes to really try to separate the wheat from the chaff. What are the tall tales? What are the urban myths versus the things that really happened? Do we know if Hippocrates was really, well, we know he existed, but were the ideas that surrounded him really from him specifically, or were they a composite of other ideas from other people? Like those kind of nuances we might not know, but those aren't the most important thing because we're just trying to explore the ideas. We know he was born on the Aegean island of Kos in the middle of the 5th century BC. We do know he is the name by which we get the Hippocratic Oath. And we know the Hippocratic Oath is something that doctors still take today, and it represents the highest in ethical standards of a physician's care. First axiom being, at first do no harm. We know his formal name means descendant of the doctor god. We knew he was born into a wealthy to middle-class family. We know he was given a solid education in all the basic subjects, which was not always readily available to everybody at Greece. I know it seems like the golden age of philosophy and enlightenment, but not everybody had access to that. We know he went on to a secondary school before learning medicine from his father and another physician. We know he traveled quite a bit throughout the Greek and the mainland, possibly Libya, Egypt, practicing medicine, studying and practicing medicine. We know he had 2 sons, and he passed on his medical knowledge to his 2 sons, and they eventually started a school for medicine on the island of Kos around 400 BC. So it's probably here that a lot of the methods that are attributed to him solidified. Specifically, there was a corpus, a 60-volume corpus called the Hippocratic Corpus, which went into great detail about his findings and his medical ideas. We know not a whole lot is known about his death, or even the age. Age varies. Some historians say around the 80s or 90s. We do know in aggregate the contribution that his thoughts and ideas made, even if they weren't all 100% from him. We all need a starting point, right? So we're just going to throw it all in a basket. We'll call it Hippocrates, and we'll continue. But back to why the father of medicine. Like, why do you get that particular title if you're Hippocrates? Well, like we said before, basically in the ancient world, there was a lot of buck passing when it came to the gods, and it was really no different when it came to sickness and diseases. So this fostered what they called at the time a supernatural view of disease. If you harbored the supernatural view of disease, it simply meant that you had a couple choices. You had divine punishment, and divine punishment would say that you really aggravated one of the gods, and now one of the gods is going to rain down their wrath upon you. And the subcategory to that is a darker force, like almost a demonic or a satanic force in the supernatural view of health, could then attach itself to you. And then you would need some sort of exorcism of sorts. You would need some sort of witchcraft to try to bind the thing off of you, right? And so this was commonly practiced in the ancient world because this was the common belief. They had not really gotten into the herbs and the plants and that kind of thing yet in terms of a full curriculum. So now you got to consider the company that Hippocrates was keeping in Egypt, right? He was surrounded by Aristotle. He was influenced by him, and he was the founder of the scientific method. Pythagoras, that amazing mathematician guy that we still study in middle school. Aristotle and Pythagoras were all putting an emphasis on reason. There was an emphasis, there was a desire, there was a impulse to go toward reason, and now it started bleeding itself into medicine. So now instead of blaming it on the gods, they weren't dismissing the gods. They weren't like some modern day Richard Dawkins where it's like, we have science, now we don't need God, right? You didn't get that kind of overreaction. It's just like, okay, we're just going to put gods on the side for right now. And in doing so, we're just going to try to look objectively at data. And in the process of looking at data, it was the first time that they started taking a more secular approach at trying to find out what it was that ailed somebody. So now that they're trying to look at, okay, maybe if it's not the gods, and maybe it's what they eat. Maybe it's what they drink. Maybe it's what they think. It was really the first time they were taking a shot at trying to understand the whole person as a holistic entity and seeing all the different environmental factors that could possibly impact somebody's health. So in doing so, they collected a lot of data. And in the collecting a lot of data, they had a lot of stuff to look at. So now, like with everything, they had this data, but data in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot, right? You need a sort of like a philosophical substrate to lay that data on, because nobody looks at the world just through blunt facts. It just doesn't work that way. Everybody has a lens by which they see the world through. So if they were taking gods out of the equation and they were no longer pinning it on gods, then what did they have? Well, second in command was nature, right? So they're just trying to make these analogies now between, all right, what do we see in nature and what's a similarity? Like these animals don't seem to get sick the same way we do. There are things that happen in nature. There are cycles. There's all these sorts of things that we can observe that maybe help to inform our understanding of health and disease. So they did this. So they sort of took this more of a pagan worldview, I guess you would call it, and they would look at what was happening in nature, and they would look at the macro cycles in nature as much as they'd look at the micro cycles in nature. So you have this as above, so below type of philosophical idea kind of undergirding their understanding of medicine at this point, right? So as they're putting this all together, they're finding macro themes. They're finding earth, water, air, and fire. They're saying, okay, these are the 4 elements. Where else do we see 4 elements? We see 4 seasons. And from the 4 elements and from the 4 seasons, they derived the 4 humors. Right? And what are the 4 humors? Well, they looked at it in terms of blood, which is symbolic of air, phlegm, which is symbolic of water, yellow bile, symbolic of fire, black bile, symbolic of earth. And they started to piece this together and they said, well, maybe health is really the balancing of all these factors, all these fluids. And from this came this philosophical idea of medicine called humorism. So it was all based on humors. And what are humors? Humors, just, you might want to look at it in terms of the blood, the liquid. So all these humors were a different liquid. And your health was sort of contingent on the excess amount of humors you might have in one area, or the lack of humors that you might have in one area, or the lack of humor you might have about life in general. Right? So they were trying to piece this all together, and in doing so, this was the template they were able to put their data on. So what are you eating? Right? Are you exercising enough? Are you having enough sex, or you're not having enough sex? Are you having enough wine, or you're not having enough wine? Are you getting in the ocean enough, or you're not getting in the ocean enough? So it was really trying to figure out how these 4 humors and these 4 seasons and these themes blend to help somebody live a balanced life. So the term was dyscrasia, and it was kind of like a non-specific term that referred to a disorder, a disease, especially a disease of the blood. And the term dyscrasia was all about keeping it all balanced. So before modern medicine, it just simply meant an imbalance of your 4 body fluids, your blood, your bile, your lymph, and your phlegm. So now they were trying to map other conditions in nature to these 4 humors. And what they found was hot, cold, wet, and dry. So if you were cold and wet, for example, so if you were chronically wet and cold, you will develop, the body will produce a lot of phlegm. In producing a lot of phlegm, you produce a lot of respiratory conditions. So their whole understanding, okay, is if you're wet and cold, you're producing phlegm, you have a lot of respiratory issues, we're going to reverse engineer that by now giving you foods that are much drier. They have a much more drier nature to them, right? So we're going to give you spices, we're going to give you garlic, we're going to give you herbs, we're going to give you things that kind of dry you out, and see if that doesn't help equalize the deficiency in the excesses or the deficiencies of your humors. If you have a fever, chances are you have an excess of blood, and this is where the whole idea of bloodletting eventually came from. Whether you cut the artery and let it bleed out, or whether you put a leech on the body, which they started doing in the medieval times. This is the whole idea that there's too much, you're running a fever, there's too much heat. Blood was always affiliated with heat. Blood, heat, air, right? So these are all the associations that they were making, all the natural observations they were making, and then trying to implant that on people. And they were having some success. At least they were collecting a lot of data, they were tweaking it a lot. At least they had some sort of template, some sort of paradigm that they could bounce all this data off of now and have some way of purposing it. The whole model was really based on addition and subtraction, basic mathematics, right? Because it was just, do you have too much of this? Then we need to take it away. Do you not have enough of this? Then we need to add it into you, right? So it was really just putting like your goods on a scale and just trying to find that sweet spot where everything balances out. Now, is this the first time we see this? No. This is done in other parts of the world concurrently. And you go all the way over to China and you have TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And in traditional Chinese medicine, their elements are fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And those are the elements, and those elements are sort of played out between this dialectical tension between yin and yang. So yin is the female energy, which is a lot more wet and moist, and yang is the male energy, which is a lot more dry, right? So you had all these components trying to balance themselves out within this dialectic of yin and yang, male, female, because everything was always about opposites. You see the same type of thing in Ayurvedic medicine, right? In Ayurvedic medicine, you have the doshas. And the doshas are Vata, which is air or ether, Pitta, which is fire or water, and then Kapha, which is earth. And sometimes these things kind of like, mix in a little bit. It's not always one or the other. There's always an overlay. But these are the general ideas. And so you had all these medical-based health ideas that were all concurring around the earth, more or less around the same time, all based on similar observations. So this built a paradigm where we went from the idea of gods making us sick to the humors, the four humors. The four humors paradigm, understanding of medicine, which started in the 5th century BC in Greece, would then take us all the way up to the 19th century. All right, so this thing had some real staying power. It had a long shelf life. They grew upon it, and volumes kept getting written about it. But this basic foundation that was laid during the Greek civilization was the foundation that they would build the house of medicine on as they went forward. And whether it was they were building that house of medicine in China, whether they were doing it in India, whether the Muslims were doing it, it's like everybody was sort of using that same foundational paradigm of understanding nature and medicine and trying to find harmony and balance in the body. Very different from our modern day version of medicine, our more pharmakeia-based medicine, our more pill-based medicine. We'll get to that because there is a point where it changed. There was a point where we went off this road and went into germ theory, and we'll get into that in great detail. But for right now, we're just trying to understand, the foundation of these ideas. So these ideas really solidified themselves over the next 100 years or so, because that's when the Hippocratic corpus was produced. So Hippocrates' sons then continued to teach, produced a medical school and continued to teach there. And then the Hippocratic corpus, which if you're into this stuff would be an interesting read. I've gone through most of it. And it's really fascinating because it's not just, it goes well beyond the humors. It eventually gets into joint manipulation. It gets into all these different areas that you wouldn't expect them to go into at this point. But they were just all over the place. Hey, it was the golden age of medicine, right? It was anything goes because there were really no rules and regulations. There was no AMA or FDA at the time to really rein you in. It was just a lot of poking and prodding, and it was really the early explosive exploration days of medicine. Now, we eventually get into the medieval period where people were doing dissections, and there were certain civilizations at certain times, and Greece was one of them, where you didn't want to really do dissections. They considered that immoral. But they would dissect animals, and then they would make these jumps from, okay, this is what we found in the frog, or this is what we found in the dog, and maybe something similar is going on inside the human, and maybe it's going on around here, or maybe it's going on around here, right? So it was a lot of fancy guessing at the time. But eventually we did start cracking open cadavers and looking, and that's where we found out a lot more stuff, but we'll get into that when we get there. The Greeks did not exclude their gods. It wasn't medicine or metaphysics. It wasn't one or the other. We have some people today who say that. We've had some people in the Middle Ages who said that, right? Certainly during the Age of Enlightenment. But in terms of the Greek civilization, they looked at all this coming from the god Asclepius. Asclepius was a mortal hero who became half human, half divine, eventually became a god, and was considered the kindest of gods because Asclepius would eventually sacrifice himself for humanity, and therefore became the wellspring or the fountainhead by which a lot of this medical information and understanding came from. Asclepius's father was Apollo, and the daughters were actually named Panacea and Pygia. Now, according to the Hippocratic corpus, you'd be surprised to find, or maybe not, that a lot of it was just basic, are you getting enough rest? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating enough? Are you moving enough? It was really what we do here on Inner Athlete Training. We try to take the basics and we try to evaluate the basics because I've seen this as a trainer in 30 years. You see people change just when they make the most fundamental, basic changes in their life. And it could be something as just getting an hour more sleep. It could be something as adding an extra 150 calories in their diet in a day, right? Maybe they just weren't getting enough and they were deficient. It could just be, 10 minutes more of exercise, could make the big difference. So you really always want to go back to basics and you want to start with the most fundamental things. And that's exactly what they were doing. It's exactly what Hippocrates was doing here. Anything that wasn't getting resolved under that condition would then be the domain of the plants and the botanicals. Then it was a matter of, okay, let's dig these things up and let's make teas out of them, make concoctions out of them. Let's see what happens when people take them and see what kind of observation we can make. And again, it all came from the thing. Is this plant hot or is it categorically cold? Is it spicy? Is it moist? Is it wet? And then they would just look at the nature of the plants, the leaves, the root, all that kind of stuff. And they would try to figure out, how do we categorize this according to our understanding of the four humors? So the corpus goes into all this. It also goes into the weather, right? How does the weather affect the humors? And how does the weather actually affect the personality? Because we probably experience that today. Sometimes you have certain headaches or compression when the weather acts a certain way. So there's a lot in our environment that can really rain down on us and affect our mood and affect our biology and affect the way we feel, especially now because we have elements that they would never even fathom 2,500 years ago. We have 5G, we have wireless radiation. We have no idea the effect that's going to have on us long term. None. Zip. Zero. Sorry, no studies have ever been done on it. And if you think you can, trust AT&T and Verizon to tell you, yeah, it's all safe, then don't. Right? Because it's like, and maybe it's fine, maybe everything will be fine, but we don't know. We don't have 20, 30 years worth of data on this yet. We're all just nervous system and cellular guinea pigs when it comes to this, but it falls into this category, right? Because there are a growing number of people who do get sick in a highly Wi-Fi'd area, right? So they may be a one-off, they may be the canary in the coal mine. They may be where we're all at eventually. Who knows? But the point is, there's a lot more that constitutes our health and stability than meets the eye. There's a lot that goes on in the environment that we're not even aware of. Never mind our own emotional stress, which is at least that we can take care of. So we know we get the Hippocratic Oath from Hippocrates. Again, he was credited with composing the oath, but we don't know for sure. We just don't know that with 100% certainty, but it doesn't diminish the value of it or what it actually stands for. So now here we are in Athens. The philosophers are philosophizing. The Pythagoreans are mathematizing. The Hippocrates are physicianizing. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing and trying to figure out life as they go with this whole new level of intellect and knowledge that they've acquired over time. But then Athens gets hit with a plague. And I bring this up because this is an interesting part of the Athenian history in medicine, and this is similar to what we're going through today in our Rona pandemic, right? But what happened with the Athenians was it was probably 2 years into the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenians were on lockdown. They were afraid that they were going to get their butts kicked by the Spartans. So they went into the compound, and people from all over the place, like people out in the countryside, they rushed in. And it's like, okay, everybody stay here, hunker down. At the same time, they were in this environment that was really tight and didn't allow a lot of space, certainly no social distancing. You had what a lot of historians are still trying to figure out. They don't know if it was typhus, they don't know if it was smallpox, but you had something that arguably might have come from Ethiopia through Egypt into Athens, and it was a plague. And what do we know about this plague? Well, we know about it primarily through Thucydides. Thucydides was a writer at the time, just like Plutarch was, right? And he was documenting, he had been exposed to this pathogen. He survived. So he became a documenter he was actually documenting the Peloponnesian War, and then put that on pause because now we have a plague to deal with. So imagine dealing with a war and then having it get interrupted by a plague. So according to him, was his best guess, that it came from Ethiopia up through Egypt and into their ports, into the Athenian ports, where they would unload boats and ships and unload merchandise. So even these terms that we use today for the coronavirus actually come from Greece, right? So you have epidemic, epi meaning above, and demos meaning mob or a crowd or group of people, right? So and then you have pandemos, right? You have pan meaning all, and demos meaning mob or meaning group of people. So you have an epidemic, which is a smaller concentration of individuals, and then you have a pandemic, which is a wider group of individuals that this pathogen is affecting. So in the case of Greece, in Athens, it was an epidemic, and there was no escape from it because, as we said before, everybody rushed in to the gates of Athens to keep themselves, to hunker down for the war. So it really worked to their disadvantage. Thucydides writes about the plague, but so great a plague and mortality of men was never remembered to have happened any place before. So they were losing up to 75 to 100,000 people, which was about 25% of their population at the time. Now, for ancient Athens, that was a huge loss because it put them also, once it was all over, about 5 years later, put them in a distinct military disadvantage because they no longer had the man and woman power to continue to fight. Thucydides was in the middle of writing a book called The History of the Peloponnesian War when the pandemic hit. And another passage that he writes in his book: violent heats in the head, redness and inflammation of the eyes, throat and tongue, quickly suffused with blood, breath became unnatural and fetid, meaning it stunk, sneezing and hoarseness, violent cough, vomiting, retching, violent convulsions, the body externally not so hot to the touch, nor yet pale, a livid color, inkling to red, breaking out in pustules and ulcers. So that just sounds awful, right? And you can imagine this happening in Greece where it's hot. People were so constantly in a fever state, headaches, fever, eyes burning, throat burning. They couldn't even wear clothes. Clothes were too warm for them. So a lot of them just walked around naked, which wasn't terribly uncommon for Greece anyway. Okay, we know that. But the point is, it was just that uncomfortable to even wear what little toga clothes they actually did wear to begin with. So they suffered quite a bit. And like with any plague, there were going to be people who were going to build an immunity to it. And those who did, and Thucydides was certainly one of them, those who did eventually started helping the people who were sick, and they tried to help them overcome it. Now, there's a lot that was going on during that time that was interesting too, because you had, as with any major crisis, you also experienced a crisis of faith. So a lot of people were questioning, the veracity of the gods. Why are the gods angry at us? Gods must be crazy. Why are they doing this to us? For all those of you who saw that crazy 1986-ish movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy, great film. Anyway, you had they were trying to figure all this out, and there was a big collapse of faith in what they normally believed, right? And then you had lawlessness. You had not everybody knowing if they would be living the next day or the next week, so they would sort of do whatever they wanted to do anyway, right? If there was somebody who just passed away of the plague, they'd go and raid their house, and people would spend whatever the money they had and whatever indulgences they could, and they lived for the moment right up until the very last minute. Now, with any crisis of faith, it also, for the truly faithful, it also strengthens one's faith, right? So you had that going on as well. But there was, for the most part, there was mass chaos around there. And there are political consequences, right? Pericles, who was the leader of the time, eventually started taking all the crap for what was going on in the plague, right? So they started just blaming him for everything. I mean, obviously Pericles did not bring the plague into the environment, But things were bad enough and awful enough for enough people and destabilized the nation state enough where Pericles was just kind of blamed for it. And we still don't know how he died. Some people do suspect he died of the plague, some years after, but nobody knows for sure. But how did this thing get resolved? So now you have Hippocrates making his medical observations, and this is, according to some historians, I don't think everybody collectively agrees on this, but he did observe that there were people who were having a large survival rate who were in the metal arts, and they were always around these hot flames and fire because they were always like bending and molding metal. So in the process of that, he noticed that, okay, they seem to not be as affected by the plague generally as a people, so maybe the heat has something to do with it. Starts a big bonfire right in the middle of the town. And they needed a place. They couldn't bury everybody because they were dying too quickly. So we needed a place to just throw bodies on the fire anyway. So they started this big bonfire. And apparently, and whether it was just coincidence or not, but the existence of the fire made enough of an impact in the air where things started changing. Now, when we get to the Middle Ages, you'll find that there's this concept called miasma. And that was this idea of the disease is actually coming through the air, through something you're breathing, something externally that you take in, right? And so this wasn't not an idea that was really that developed in Greece 2,500 years ago, but it was a similar concept to think that the fire, the flame, the condition of the heat might have actually changed the external environment enough to move things, out in a different direction and actually change the course of where things were going. Depends on which historian you talk to, right? But that was, for some of them, they believe that this is the way it actually started coming to an end. But it did run its course naturally it lasted about 5 years. And they did lose a lot of people, but, they picked up and continued on. So basically, in a nutshell, we covered the supernatural view of disease, and we covered the natural causation view of disease. And we saw how the ideas that were cemented in the 5th century BC lasted all the way up through the 19th century. Okay, and next time when we go into Rome, we're going to look at physical culture and continue with the philosophy of physical culture. But you'll see that Galen would be the next, would be the Roman Hippocrates. He would be the next one to carry that torch and bring the understanding of the 4 humors to the next level. And Galen had a lot of practice with this because he dealt with a lot of Roman centurions and soldiers. They were always coming back, completely brutalized and battered. So he had a lot of good opportunities to start looking under the hood of the human body and figuring things out. So we'll build on that as we go on. But again, this time just wanted to really emphasize, the idea of the body, pulling the ontological status, the metaphysical status of our understanding of medicine from God or gods to that of nature. And then these ideas that developed and evolved out of nature and laid the foundation for a very long time, from the 5th century BC all the way up to the 19th century, ideas and concepts that would last a long time. Now, they wouldn't have lasted that long if they didn't have a strong foundation, right? So they did have a pretty strong foundation, but things change, and that's why we're here on Inner Athlete Training, to explore those changes, because, as we said before, ideas and philosophies matter, and that's why it's very important for you to really think about these things on a critical level and bring them into your own life. What do you believe about things? Have you even tested them yet? Have you even put them through the wash of extreme logic and extreme rhetoric, quadrivium, trivium, all those types of things, which we'll go into those types of thinking, down the road. But again, we always emphasize the idea that thoughts matter, they are important, and if we can see that thoughts that were thunk, thousands of years ago still have some veracity thousands of years later, then there's a quality to them, right? Perhaps not with all. Some probably should have been laid to the wayside. But for the vast ones that maintain over a long period of time, there's a reason they do. So it's always worth looking under the hood and trying to figure out, what is it about those ideas that has lasted so long and why are they valuable? Because in the free marketplace of ideas, you would assume that things that don't last very long will eventually go away. And we see that now with alternative medicine, right? Because a lot of new age thought in medicine that we embrace today comes from these foundational ideas from 2,500 years ago, right? So if you go to your traditional doctor, maybe you'll get like, oh, sleep more, drink more water, blah, 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 right? But you're not going to get the humoral understanding, right? But if you go to a traditional Chinese medicine doctor or a naturopath or an osteopath or a homeopath, then you will get that kind of instruction because they still carry those early Greek Hippocratic ideas of medicine and still practice them today. Now, again, in the landscape of ideas, in the free marketplace of ideas, if these ideas didn't work for a vast majority of people, then they would have disappeared because everybody just would have been like, yeah, that sucks. That doesn't work, right? So you're going to find that there are things written in medical journals saying that, oh, homeopathy is bunk. We haven't found any, double crossover placebo studies that, validate this, that, or the other thing. And maybe that's true, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not having an effect on somebody, whether it's placebo-based or not. And this is the whole thing about medicine that really, blows my whistle, is that the placebo effect is just pretty much dismissed as, oh, the placebo effect. Well, this pill should have worked and that didn't work, but we're just going to go with the placebo effect. Okay, but the placebo effect is the belief system of the person, and that's the thing that's actually driving the change. Like, how does that not get the vast majority of resources, intellectual and financial equity? Like, why do you just keep going back to the molecules when you could be, doing more elaborate studies on the brain? So you'll get that kind of experimentation in the more alternative health fields. And a lot of the alternative health fields will get dismissed as being woo-woo because they don't paint by the numbers, as well as traditional science does. But it doesn't mean that it's not working, and it doesn't mean that it's inefficient. And it doesn't mean that there's not some science for it. I mean, even if you look up homeopathy or you look up any of these alternative modalities, there is some science. It's scant compared to Big Pharma because Big Pharma has virtually endless funds by which they can keep financing this stuff, right? Alternative medicine, not so much. Alternative medicine did actually have a grant given to them, which I still think exists, but it started in the 1990s under the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, where they wanted to actually start researching some of these alternative therapies. And I believe that is a good use of government money because the private sector will not take a deep dive into doing those kind of studies because it will never be a return on investment, right? So if I'm Johnson & Johnson, if I'm some big pharmaceutical company, like why would I spend 20 years and $30 million investigating vitamin C when I know there's not going to be a return on investment on it? Because you can't patent something that occurs naturally. At best, you can take a synthetic derivative and create something new out of it and patent that. And this is why when even in the Greek civilization, when they started with the herbals and the plants, like everything we need to heal us is within the plant community. And even most of your pharmaceutical companies will go to the rainforests at different parts of the world and find that one component in that one plant and disrupt a whole community of people and ecosystem over it so they can extract that and create their own division of it, their own synthetic derivative of it. But just think, if they can find that one component in that one plant that might be anti-cancerous, then imagine what the totality of that plant could do for you if taken raw or as a tea or as a root. And this is the whole craft of herbalism. Herbalism is a phenomenal study, and I have just not even scratched the surface, but it's a phenomenal study because everything is coming down to plants. And as we know, when you look at plants are what make this world. I mean, if you've seen those documentaries on the Discovery Channel, what the world looks like without humans, once we're out of the picture, it's all plants. It's not cockroaches. It's not rats. It's not mice. It's not cats, right? It's going to be plants. You have plants that crawl up the side of buildings, and they have enzymes in them that actually break down the concrete. So enough plants engulf a building. Eventually, that building that we created is eventually going to come tumbling down. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of power in plants. There's a tremendous amount of medicine. There's a tremendous amount of poison. If you don't know what you're doing with plants, you can poison yourself. But this is why there's so much richness in studying this whole history of medicine, and why we're starting at the Greek civilization and taking it all the way up, because you're going to see that it was all the medicinals, it was all the plants that would eventually, ultimately heal the people. One, if there was a disease state. So if there was a disease state in the person, that your basic rest, relaxation, balancing of the humors, balancing of your life energies, if that couldn't handle it, and there was really a disease brewing under the hood, then it was always the plant-based medicines that would eventually bring the person to health. So what does vis medicatrix natura mean anyway? It means the healing power of nature in Latin. So that's why we call the episode this. So we want to thank you for joining us. We hope you're getting a lot out of this, and we will see you on the next episode of Inner Athlete Training. Until then, keep training, keep moving, keep drinking water, keep staying healthy, keep getting enough rest, keep doing all your basics, and we will see you on the next one.